I mean, the backdrop of this conversation at the moment, we have a mini blasphemy row occurring in the UK at a school in Yorkshire, and you took a very principled stand on that in one of your tweets. I think you affirmed in the response to a question you heard in the media that you would not ban anti-Semitic images in the classroom if they were used to teach about the dehumanization of Jews during the Holocaust, which is, I think, a wonderful position to take on that. But isn't it an example of part of the problem you point out in your book, that even when we've got this situation unfolding, which is completely unrelated from Judaism or Jews, that we're still getting "what about the Jews" questions in response to it?
Well, that's a very good point, right? Is that, well, in Germany, where my book is coming out quite soon, I don't know if this quite answers your point, but it feels like a way in. They said to me, we can't call it Jews Don't Count, which in German is Juden zahlen nicht. It's just too difficult, they said, with our history. Right?
It sounded sinister with you just saying it then, I'll be honest.
Well, to be honest with you, the problem is they've suggested "und die Juden?" ? And the Jews ? Which sounds
like the Jewish question. It's still very problematic.
I mean, it may just be the word Juden is problematic, but "und die Juden" sounds exactly something to me that's in a war film said by a very creepy Nazi at the end of a meeting. But you're right. You're right. It happens a lot. It happens a lot that whenever there's any kind of ethnic, religious, whatever row, then the question is raised, well, how would this play for the Jews? And I think that is because, in our cultural imagination, I personally think correctly, although I note that I've had rows on Twitter about this, the greatest racial atrocity that we know of, or certainly the one that we default to, is the Holocaust. And so when people are arguing about race and religion or whatever, that is brought in because it's sort of the end point in people's minds of like any row, any sense of race or religion or whatever. From my own point of view, I sometimes do try and imagine how things might be like for the Jew. I mean, the book does that. The book is a lot of the time saying, okay, here is, because the book also does something which I realize you're not meant to do in this conversation, which is that if I was talking about anti-Semitism online and I compared, say, an anti-Semitic incident and the lack of, reaction from the left to an anti-Semitic incident and said, if this was any other minority, there would be outcry, right? And I use lots of examples of that in the book. Sometimes I would get back people saying, it's not a competition and, you're throwing other minorities under the bus and all this kind of stuff. And I decided, you know what, I'm just going to ignore, I grapple with it in the book, but I'm basically saying, no, this is what I'm going to do, because this is a sort of larger question, Stephen, but, the cry of whataboutery, right, which you get a lot online, right, I also think that's a canard. I think like the history of intellectual thought has involved comparison. Right. And sometimes you have to compare a situation to another situation to shed light on it. And in this situation, why are Jews being neglected by the guardians of identity politics compared to other minorities? You've got no choice because it is a comparison. That's what the whole book's about.
I love the fact when you relay an anecdote in the book about you talking about anti-Semitism and you invoke, Nazi Germany, and somebody pulls you up on Godwin's law, which I think that's wonderful.
I know. I actually really like that bit in the book. You're the first person to point to it, yeah. But for anyone who doesn't know, there's probably no one watching this or listening to this, but yeah, Godwin's law is that thing where he said a bloke called Stephen Godwin said that any argument online will default within 2 posts to the Nazis. And he's right about that, of course. Except my point is, if you're talking about anti-Semitism, you are always allowed to do that.
Yeah, that's the free pass, surely.
Well, it's a total free pass. And actually, it's so amazing. The history is so amazing when you know it. When you know that the Nazis... I did Al Murray's podcast the other day, his history podcast.
Yeah.
And... I've forgotten his name, the historian on that. That's bad. Is it Tom Holland? But that's the bloke.
Tom Holland, yeah. Tom Holland's a historian. He's absolutely excellent.
Yeah, well, I think it's him. If it isn't, I apologise. But anyway, the thing that they pointed out, which is absolutely true, is that the Nazis kind of lost the war. They'd already kind of lost the war in 1942 or something, but basically carried it on to kill Jews. But I mean, it's a simplification, but it's true that if the Nazis hadn't been so committed to the eradication of European Jews, the war would have been completely different. They diverted all sorts of stuff, all sorts of energy, all men and arms, and obviously, rail tracks and all sorts of things they could have been doing because they were absolutely psychotically dedicated to the eradication of the Jews. So that is a real end point. When people do that thing of saying, oh, next thing you know, we'll be on cattle trucks and blah, 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 and you think that's bollocks. When you're talking about anti-Semitism, it's not bollocks because it did happen.
So with that in mind, and the historical atrocities that are well documented under the Third Reich, how do you feel about how casually the word Nazi's thrown around in online discourse, mainly in earnest now? It is hyperbole, but these people seem to mean what they say when they call someone a Nazi.
Yeah, I don't like it. I've talked about this. Like, for example, you get it on all sides.
Yeah.
You get it on, you definitely, like I got really angry the other day when there were pictures from an anti-lockdown march. And not only was there someone Sieg Heiling at the police, but more horribly, there was a woman with a yellow star on her hoodie saying, "We mustn't let this happen again." Right? And I just said, I described what had happened to my grandparents who had to wear that star, and then said, "This is not happening to you." Right? It's such a sort of.
It's not so much never again, more not at all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or not even in the window of whatever your imagination fucking is. But I wrote a long piece on for the Sunday Times just before the book came out about Arnold Schwarzenegger's use of Kristallnacht to describe the Capitol riot.
Oh, I saw that.
And that was very applauded by a lot of my friends and people who I think of as, probably like-minded in many ways on social media. They retweeted Arnold Schwarzenegger. And obviously Arnold Schwarzenegger was right in many ways when he talked about, that event. But the comparison with Kristallnacht is a complicated one because it really isn't like Kristallnacht. And I can go through the historical reasons for that. But they're basically, Kristallnacht just involved many, 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 many more people dying. And it was also organized by the state. Was organized by the state against an ethnic group. Right now, you could say, well, Trump is the state, but really Trump is just a complete fucking mad maverick drumming up mad. And I'm not saying that, that wasn't a serious thing. It fucking was a serious thing. And it did show, in a way, how close we are always to society breaking down. I absolutely think it did show that. But it's still complicated to use Kristallnacht. And the example I would go to, or the theory I would go to is Deborah Lipstadt. Have you heard of Deborah Lipstadt?
No, actually, I don't think I'm aware.
Okay, so Deborah Lipstadt is a historian who has written extensively about Holocaust denial.
Right.
I interviewed her in my documentary that I made about Holocaust denial, and she pinpoints many different types of Holocaust denial, apart from straight out, it didn't happen, did 6 million really die, which is hardcore Holocaust denial. She talks about softcore Holocaust denial, and you see this a lot. You see it a lot on the left. So softcore Holocaust denial would include sort of Holocaust fatigue. We've heard a lot about this. Maybe we need to hear about some other atrocities. And the other thing she talks about is easy comparisons of, much lesser things to the Nazis. And that isn't, I don't know if that's Holocaust. I mean, you have to use her phrase, I think, because there is obviously a difference between that. And I'm sure people who would say, oh, Trump is a Nazi, generally would not say the Holocaust didn't happen.
Yeah.
At the same time, it does minimize what the Nazis were and what that atrocity was. So it does get on my nerves, and I never use it to describe anything but actual Nazis. I mean, to be clear, I do use it to describe neo-Nazis who completely exist and are really dangerous.
Yeah, I agree. So, you're primarily known by most people as a comedian. And obviously, a book on anti-Semitism, it's a huge topic. It's not something typically addressed from the comedy world in sort of book form. Obviously, I appreciate it makes its way into stand-up routine and things like that. And the book is obviously peppered throughout with your brand of humour, and I did chuckle throughout as well. And I'm just wondering, is there something about comedy and your comedic background that is something that helps you address this issue better than if you sort of didn't have that in your wheelhouse, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a really good question, because I thought you were going to say which have been asked already, sort of like, is this you moving towards, a more kind of intellectual, less comedic way of being? And
that would have been a better question. Should we go back?
It wouldn't. It's not a better question, because that's a more obvious question.
Right.
That's a more route one question, to use a football analogy, because the answer to that is that I think, been, wanting to come out of the intellectual closet for quite a long time. Although I don't really see that binary. I think it is a bit of a simple binary, because I think comedy is often very intellectual, even if it's not obviously intellectual, right? So even slapstick takes a lot of thought, really funny slapstick to create and whatever, and it's kind of mathematical, like even like Mr. Bean or Laurel and Hardy or Reeves and Mortimer. There's an incredible amount of thought goes into that kind of stuff. So I don't really accept that, but without doubt, I'm someone who, I've written 4 adult novels and 8 children novels, and I've been writing and doing stuff and documentaries for a long time that isn't just straightforward comedy. At the same time, and this answers your question, I don't think I've done anything virtually where I haven't used the voice that I create as a stand-up in the intellectual process. So this book is probably the best example of it, in that it's about a very serious subject, and it includes some very high-flown thought, I guess, and some very emotional elements to it, but it's also got funny stories in it, jokes and whatever. And a woman, an academic called Devorah Baum, who's written about anti-Semitism, wrote to me and said, very sweetly in a way, because she's written her own book about anti-Semitism. She said, what I can't get that you've got is voice. And what she means by that is you've got a very distinctive voice, and thus people will listen to you more, right, on this difficult subject. And that's probably true, because most people, when picking up a book about anti-Semitism, will just think, this is probably a bit heavy, possibly a bit dry, as you said, probably draws on some very difficult history or whatever. And it does draw on some of those things, but it's not a difficult read. Even though it's got difficult ideas in it, I don't think it's a difficult read. And that's because I write a little bit like I'm speaking, I think. Even when I'm being quite complex, I sort of feel like I'm speaking. Yeah. And that must come from stand-up, I think, that notion of this is how I express myself, as if I'm talking to you on stage or whatever. And stand-up itself is that, because stand-up is like, unlike drama or anything like that, it's actually people trying to speak directly to the audience rather than in character or whatever.